Right before we dive in, let's make this story bigger than just me and you. Tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from, and what's the clock striking there? Morning, night, or somewhere in between, I want to see how far this story can reach. Now lean closer. Here's where it all begins. In the winter of 1887, when the Yellowstone River ran thick with ice and thicker with blood, a 16-year-old boy learned that sometimes salvation comes not with words, but with the terrible silence of a man who has nothing left to lose, and everything left to protect. This is the story of what happens when corporate greed meets ancient wisdom, when industrial violence collides with traditional justice, and when a ghost from the wilderness emerges to settle debts that have been accumulating interest for 15 brutal years. The crack split the morning air like rifle fire, sharp and final against the crystalline silence of the Yellowstone River, where Tommy Clearwater had been running for his life since before dawn broke over the Montana Territory. His moccasined feet, crafted by his Crow grandmother's weathered hands from elk hide and sinew, found purchase on the treacherous ice for one desperate heartbeat before the surface shifted beneath him like a living thing in pain, sending spiderwebs of fracture lines racing toward the distant shore like frozen lightning seeking ground. His breath came in ragged clouds that crystallized instantly in the bitter air, each exhale a prayer to whatever spirit still watched over half-breed boys caught between two worlds that wanted neither hide nor hair of him, the white man's world that saw him as savage, and the native world that questioned his pale father's blood. The bundle of beaver pelts strapped across his narrow shoulders with strips of rawhide felt heavier with each stumbling step, 30 prime winter coats that represented more than mere commerce. They were the difference between surviving until spring or joining the bleached bones that littered the canyon floor 100 feet below the ice. Blood from the gash above his left eye, opened by a rifle butt wielded with practiced cruelty an hour before dawn, had frozen into rusty crystals on his dark cheek, each drop a crimson testament to the kind of justice that company men dispensed to those who dared challenge their territorial claims. The metallic taste in his mouth spoke of loosened teeth and split lips. But Tommy Clearwater had learned long ago that pain was just another kind of weather, something to endure until it passed, like blizzards or drought or the particular cruelty of men who measured worth in dollars rather than dignity. Behind him, growing closer with each heartbeat, the sound of hoofbeats on frozen ground echoed across the winter landscape, punctuated by the harsh laughter of men who hunted other men for sport and called it business, who tracked human prey with the same casual efficiency they might apply to wolves or bears, except wolves and bears, at least, were honest about their predatory nature. The ice beneath Tommy's feet sang with accumulated stress, a low harmonic that vibrated through his bones and spoke of structural failure as imminent as sunrise, as inevitable as death. Each step became a calculation balanced on terror's edge. Too slow, and Crawford's rifle would solve the problem with permanent finality. Too fast, and the ice would open beneath him like a hungry mouth, swallowing him into water cold enough to stop a 16-year-old heart in minutes rather than hours. "There's the little thief!" The voice cut across the ice like a whip crack forged in hell's own foundries, carrying the particular cruelty that men reserved for those they considered less than human, less than worthy of the mercy they might show a favored hunting dog. "Thought you could outrun company horses on foot, did you, Breed? Thought those mongrel legs could carry you faster than good American horse flesh?" Tommy's dark eyes, inheritance from his Crow mother's proud lineage, flicked toward the tree line where 3 mounted figures emerged from the snow-heavy pines like wolves materializing from winter shadows, like nightmares given substance and armed with repeating rifles. Even at this distance, with ice fog blurring the details, he recognized the lead rider's silhouette, broad shoulders made broader by a buffalo coat that had cost more than most men earned in a year, a face like weathered leather stretched over granite, and pale eyes that held all the warmth of January wind howling down from Canada. Silas Crawford, foreman of the Northwest Fur Company's enforcement division, had earned his reputation collecting debts that couldn't be paid with money, settling disputes that territorial law couldn't touch, and solving problems that required solutions measured in blood rather than legal precedent. He specialized in lessons that left permanent marks, in justice that came measured by the ounce rather than the scale, and in demonstrating to anyone foolish enough to challenge company authority that there were fates considerably worse than simple death. The stories that followed Crawford through every trading post from here to the Pacific spoke of men who'd crossed the company and simply vanished, of native villages that had challenged territorial claims and been found empty when spring came, of half-breed children who'd been caught poaching and whose bodies had washed up downstream weeks later, bearing signs of education that no civilized court would ever investigate. The other two riders flanked Crawford with the practiced ease of men accustomed to running prey to ground, their formation speaking of experience gained through seasons of this particular kind of hunting. Jake Morrison, thin as a knife blade and twice as sharp, kept his Spencer rifle trained on Tommy's stumbling figure with the patience of a professional killer, his pale eyes tracking movement with the steady concentration of a man who'd learned to kill at distance and take pride in his accuracy. Beside him, Dutch Henning sat his horse like a sack of grain, but his meaty hands held a coiled rope with deceptive gentleness, the kind of gentleness that came just before the noose tightened, the sort of careful attention to detail that spoke of a man who took professional pride in his work, regardless of its nature. Dutch had been with the company for 8 years, and in that time, he'd earned a reputation for being able to make a hanging look like suicide, an accident, or simple misfortune, whatever the situation required to keep territorial authorities from asking uncomfortable questions. Tommy's grandfather's voice echoed across 15 winters of hard-earned wisdom, lessons taught beside fires that burned buffalo chips and sage, knowledge passed down through generations of people who'd learned to read the land's moods like scripture. When the ice speaks, boy, you listen. When it cracks, you pray. When it breaks, you'd better already be somewhere else, because the river spirits don't forgive mistakes, and they don't offer second chances to those who ignore their warnings. But there was nowhere else to be, nowhere else to run in a landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions, offering no shelter except what a man could find in his own courage and cunning. The river stretched before him like a frozen highway to nowhere, its surface unmarked except for his own desperate tracks and the growing web of stress fractures that followed him like a curse, like some malevolent spirit that fed on fear and desperation. Behind him lay capture, certain beating and probable death, the kind of slow, methodical destruction that men like Crawford had perfected through years of practice on those who couldn't fight back. Ahead lay the uncertain promise of ice that might hold his weight for another 100 yards, another 50, another desperate step into a future that grew more uncertain with each heartbeat. The beaver pelts seemed to grow heavier with each stride, their rich brown fur representing a fortune in any trading post from here to St. Louis, enough wealth to keep a family fed and warm through the hardest winter the territory could deliver. 30 prime winter coats, trapped legally on unclaimed territory according to every map Tommy had ever seen, every boundary marker his Crow grandfather had taught him to read in the lay of the land itself, in the subtle signs that spoke of ownership older than any paper document drawn up in Washington. His grandfather had taught him to read the ice like a book written in a language older than words, to understand the subtle color changes that spoke of thickness and weakness, the almost invisible stress lines that could mean the difference between safe passage and a plunge into water cold enough to stop a heart in minutes. The old man's weathered hands had guided Tommy's young fingers over surfaces that looked identical to untrained eyes, teaching him to feel the difference between ice that would hold a man's weight and ice that would collapse at the first step. But maps drawn in Washington meant nothing to men like Crawford, and territorial boundaries existed only where company money said they existed, where corporate influence could bend territorial law to accommodate profit margins and expansion plans. The Northwest Fur Company had claimed this entire stretch of river through methods that had nothing to do with legal precedent and everything to do with the kind of persuasion that came at rifle point. Backed by territorial officials who understood that their own positions depended on maintaining relationships with entities that controlled more wealth than entire counties. "You know what I like about you half-breeds?" Crawford's voice carried easily across the ice, conversational as a man discussing the weather or the prospects for spring planting, but underneath the casual tone lay something harder than winter iron, colder than the wind coming off the river. "You always think you're smarter than white men. Think you can read the land better, track better, trap better. Think your savage instincts make you superior to Christian civilization." Tommy kept his eyes fixed on the ice ahead, reading the subtle color changes that spoke of thickness and weakness like a scholar parsing ancient texts, interpreting the almost invisible stress lines that could mean the difference between safe passage and a plunge into water cold enough to stop a heart in minutes. His crow blood gave him instincts that company men would never possess, senses honed by generations of survival in country that killed the unprepared with casual indifference, that tested every man against standards that had nothing to do with wealth or position. But his white blood had given him something else, the particular burden of understanding exactly what Crawford and his men intended to do to him, the education in civilized cruelty that came from living between worlds and belonging fully to neither. He'd seen company justice before, watched it applied to other boys who'd been caught where they weren't supposed to be, doing things that threatened company profits or challenged territorial assumptions about who had the right to live where and under what conditions. The memory of Little Wolf's body, found 3 miles downstream after Crawford's last lesson in territorial respect, made Tommy's stomach clench with something colder than winter wind. The boy had been Tommy's age, half Blackfoot and half Irish, caught trapping beaver on land, the company claimed, despite territorial maps that showed it as unclaimed territory open to any man willing to face its dangers. They'd found him tied to a cottonwood tree, his body bearing signs of education that had taken hours to complete, lessons in respect that had been carved into flesh with the methodical precision of men who took professional pride in their work. The territorial marshal had ruled it death by exposure, noting that half-breed boys often died during harsh winters, and that there was no evidence of foul play beyond what might be expected from wolves or other scavengers. "But you never quite figure out that being smart don't mean a damn thing when you're outnumbered," Crawford continued, his voice carrying the patient satisfaction of a teacher delivering a lesson he'd repeated many times before. "Don't mean nothing when you're facing men with better guns, better horses, and the backing of legal authority that stretches all the way back to Washington itself." The ice beneath Tommy's feet sang with accumulated stress, a low harmonic that vibrated through his bones and spoke of structural failure approaching like distant thunder, like the sound of avalanches building in high country where one wrong step could bring down entire mountainsides. Each step became a calculation balanced on a knife's edge. Too slow, and Crawford's rifle would solve the problem permanently. Too fast, and the ice would open beneath him like a hungry mouth, swallowing him into depths that would claim his bones until spring thaw released them downstream. "Nowhere to run now, boy." Morrison's voice carried the particular satisfaction of a predator closing on wounded prey, the tone of a man who'd spent enough years hunting other men to know the sound of desperation when he heard it. "Ice won't hold much longer, and that water's cold enough to freeze your mongrel blood solid before you could swim 10 strokes. Tommy could hear the truth in the observation, could feel it in the way the surface gave slightly under his weight, flexing like a drumhead under increasing pressure, responding to his passage with subtle movements that spoke of structural integrity stretched to its absolute limits. The mathematical reality was simple and brutal. He was trapped between men who wanted him dead and ice that might accommodate their wishes without requiring them to waste ammunition or explanations. But his grandfather had taught him that mathematics was only one kind of truth, and often not the most important kind in country where survival depended on understanding forces that couldn't be measured with instruments or calculated with formulas. There were older calculations at work in country like this, older equations that balanced blood and courage against cold and fear, that weighed the value of a life against the cost of dignity surrendered to those who measured worth in dollars rather than honor. The old man's voice echoed across the years, carrying lessons learned through decades of survival in territory that killed the unprepared. When the spirits test you, boy, they don't care about your fear. They care about your heart, about whether you'll stand up when standing up is the only choice that matters. Ice will hold a brave man longer than it will hold a coward, because courage changes the weight of a man's steps. Tommy had never fully understood what his grandfather meant by those words, had always assumed they were metaphor rather than literal instruction. But now, with death approaching from behind and treacherous ice ahead, he began to sense something deeper in the old teachings. Something that had to do with the relationship between intention and outcome, between the spirit a man carried and the world's response to that spirit. The shadow appeared at the edge of Tommy's vision like smoke given substance, like winter mist condensing into human form through some process that had more to do with magic than meteorology. At first, Tommy thought the cold had addled his brain, conjuring salvation from desperation and wishful thinking, creating phantom rescue from the kind of hope that came when a 16-year-old boy faced death and found himself unwilling to surrender without a fight. But the figure kept coming, growing more solid with each heartbeat, until Tommy could make out the details that separated hallucination from impossible reality, that transformed desperate hope into something that might actually exist in the world of flesh and blood and winter morning. A man, tall and gaunt as a lodgepole pine that had survived decades of mountain weather, moving across the treacherous ice with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where every weakness lay hidden beneath the deceptive surface. He wore buckskins gone gray with age and weather, leather that had been worked soft as cloth and stained dark with years of smoke and sweat and the honest labor of survival in country that tested every man against standards that had nothing to do with civilization's comforts. A wolf fur parka rippled around his shoulders, the pelt so perfectly matched to the winter landscape that he seemed to appear and disappear as he moved, like something that belonged so completely to the wilderness that the eye had trouble distinguishing him from snow and shadow. But it was his face that made Tommy's breath catch in his throat, that transformed the moment from simple surprise to something approaching awe. Weathered brown as old leather left too long in sun and wind, marked with lines that spoke of sorrows carried too long and griefs that had carved themselves into bone, written in flesh the history of a man who'd seen too much and carried too many burdens that couldn't be shared or set down. The stranger's pale eyes held something that made the air itself seem to thin. Something that transformed the mathematics of the situation from simple predator and prey to an equation infinitely more complex and dangerous. They were the eyes of a man who'd already lost everything that mattered to him, who'd made peace with death years ago and found something harder than courage in that acceptance. The terrible freedom that came when a man had nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. Crawford's laughter died in his throat as the figure on the ice continued its approach, moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with accident or coincidence, that spoke of intention as focused and inevitable as winter itself. The foreman's hand dropped instinctively to his sidearm, fingers curling around familiar grip with the practiced ease of a man who'd survived frontier violence through superior firepower and absolute ruthlessness, through the understanding that hesitation was often the difference between living and dying. "Who the hell?" Morrison began. but Crawford's sharp gesture cut him off mid-sentence. The foreman's pale eyes fixed on the approaching figure with the intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle that might determine whether he lived through the next 10 minutes. They all knew stories of the ghost trapper, the silent hunter who moved through company territory like smoke through trees, leaving no trail and taking no sides in the small wars that defined territorial commerce and determined who lived where and under what conditions. Most of the stories were whiskey talk and campfire nonsense, the kind of tales that grew in the telling until myth became indistinguishable from memory, until fact and fiction blended into legend that served the storyteller's purpose rather than historical accuracy. But the figure approaching across the ice was no campfire story. No whiskey-born phantom conjured from the imaginations of men who spent too many lonely nights around fires that couldn't quite keep the darkness at bay. He was flesh and blood, and something harder than either. Something that made experienced killers recalculate odds they'd thought were carved in stone, that forced men accustomed to being the most dangerous predators in any situation to consider the possibility that they might have encountered something even more dangerous than themselves. Tommy felt the shift in the air like a barometric change before a storm, the subtle alteration in atmospheric pressure that warned of weather systems colliding with devastating potential, of forces gathering that would reshape the landscape of the morning in ways that couldn't be predicted or controlled. The stranger's presence had changed the fundamental nature of the confrontation, introducing variables that transformed simple pursuit into something infinitely more complex and dangerous. The ice continued to sing its song of impending collapse, stress fractures spreading like disease through the crystalline structure. But somehow the approaching figure seemed immune to the surface's weakness, his steps finding purchase where others would have broken through, his movement suggesting a relationship with the ice that went deeper than simple understanding of its physical properties. The stranger reached Tommy's position with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent decades reading ice like scripture, understanding its moods and weaknesses with the intimacy that came from survival measured in moments rather than years, from the kind of education that killed those who learned slowly or imperfectly. He stopped just close enough to speak without raising his voice, his pale eyes taking in the blood on Tommy's face, and the fear in his dark gaze with the assessment of a man who'd seen too much violence and learned to read its signs with professional accuracy. "You hurt, son?" The voice carried the quiet authority of deep water running over stone, words chosen carefully and used sparingly, as if speech itself was a finite resource not to be wasted on unnecessary conversation, as if silence was the natural state, and words were intrusions to be employed only when absolutely required by circumstances beyond his control. Tommy shook his head, not trusting his voice to remain steady, overwhelmed by the stranger's presence in ways that went beyond simple relief at potential rescue. There was something about the man that spoke of depths Tommy couldn't fathom, of experiences that had shaped him into something harder and more enduring than ordinary humanity, something that belonged to the wilderness in ways that transcended simple familiarity with its dangers and opportunities. The stranger's pale eyes shifted to the three riders, now advancing more cautiously across the ice, their horses picking their way carefully across surface that had seemed solid minutes before, but now sang with stress fractures and potential collapse, responding to the accumulated weight with increasingly urgent warnings of structural failure approaching like avalanche or flood. "Company men," the stranger observed, his tone carrying no more emotion than if he'd been commenting on the weather or the phase of the moon, but underneath the apparent indifference lay something harder than winter iron, colder than the wind coming off the glacial peaks that defined the eastern horizon. Tommy felt something shift in his understanding of the situation, some fundamental alteration in the mathematics of survival that he couldn't yet calculate but could sense with instincts inherited from ancestors who'd learned to read danger in the subtle signs that preceded violence. The stranger's presence had transformed the confrontation from simple predator and prey to something infinitely more complex, had introduced elements that neither Crawford nor his men could have anticipated or prepared for. Josiah Whitehawk felt the familiar ache in his chest where his heart used to live, the hollow space that 15 years of silence hadn't been able to fill or heal, that remained as raw and empty as the morning he'd buried his wife and son in ground frozen too hard for proper graves. The boy beside him had his son's eyes, dark and fierce, with the particular courage that came from having nothing left to lose, from facing odds that would have broken lesser spirits. The same stubborn set to his shoulders that little Hawk had possessed, the same way of standing straight despite pain that would have bent lesser souls, the same mixture of fear and defiance that spoke of blood that refused to be broken regardless of what the world threw against it. The resemblance was more than physical. It was spiritual, the recognition of kinship that transcended bloodlines and spoke to something deeper than genetics. The memories crashed over him like spring floodwater, carrying with them the scent of wood smoke and wild roses, the sound of laughter that had been silenced forever on a morning much like this one, when cavalry justice had come calling with the backing of territorial authority and left nothing but graves and ashes in its wake, nothing but questions that would never be answered and debts that would never be officially acknowledged. Little Hawk would have been this boy's age now, would have stood just this tall, would have faced danger with exactly this mixture of fear and defiance, would have carried himself with the same proud bearing that spoke of heritage older than the territorial boundaries that white men drew on maps. The thought was a knife turning in an old wound, but Josiah welcomed the pain because it reminded him that some things were worth bleeding for, that some silences needed to be broken regardless of the personal cost. He'd spoken perhaps 100 words in the past 5 years, and none of them had mattered, none of them had changed anything or brought back what had been lost, or made the world 1 degree warmer or more just than it had been before he opened his mouth. But standing between this boy and company guns felt like the first meaningful conversation he'd had since the world ended on a snow-covered morning in 1872, when he'd learned that love could be destroyed by policy, and that justice was a luxury that some people couldn't afford. Crawford pulled his horse to a halt, 20 yards from where Josiah and Tommy stood, close enough to ensure that rifle shots would be accurate, far enough to avoid any unpleasant surprises the ghost trapper might have concealed about his person. The foreman's pale eyes moved between the two figures, with the calculating assessment of a man pricing livestock, weighing options with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to solving problems through the application of superior force. "Well, well," Crawford said, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a predator who'd cornered 2 prizes instead of 1. The particular pleasure that came when a simple collection task evolved into something more personally rewarding. "The famous ghost trapper himself. Been wanting to meet you for some time now, old man. You've cost the company considerable money with your interference in legitimate business operations." Josiah said nothing, his pale eyes fixed on Crawford's face with the unblinking intensity of a hawk studying prey, with the patient assessment of a predator who'd learned to read the subtle signs that preceded violence and had developed the patience to wait for exactly the right moment to strike. His hands hung loose at his sides, apparently relaxed. But Tommy could sense the coiled tension in his weathered frame, the potential for violence held in careful check like a spring under compression. The ice beneath their feet groaned with accumulated stress, responding to the weight of horses and men with increasingly urgent warnings, stress fractures spreading like spider webs through the crystalline structure. But Crawford seemed oblivious to the danger, his attention focused entirely on the confrontation that had been building for months, the settling of accounts that had nothing to do with stolen beaver pelts and everything to do with challenges to corporate authority. "Cat got your tongue?" Morrison laughed, bringing his rifle to bear with practiced ease, the motion smooth and confident despite the treacherous footing. "Heard you don't talk much. Well, bullets have a way of making even strong, silent types real talkative real quick, especially when they're applied to sensitive areas with the proper degree of professional attention. Dutch Henning shifted nervously in his saddle, his experienced eye reading the ice conditions with growing alarm. He'd seen enough winter violence to know that environmental dangers could kill just as efficiently as human malice, and often with less warning. Crawford leaned forward in his saddle, studying Josiah with the interest of a man examining a particularly interesting specimen, a curiosity that represented something he'd heard about but never encountered in person. "You know what your problem is, old man. You think the wilderness belongs to everyone. Think the old ways still matter, that a man can still live free if he's willing to accept the hardships that come with rejecting civilized society." The foreman's voice took on the patient tone of someone explaining basic facts to a slow child, the condescending clarity of a man who'd never doubted his own superiority or questioned the assumptions that governed his understanding of the world. "But this is 1887, not 1847. The frontier's closing, the railroad's coming, and men like you are just obstacles to progress. Romantic obstacles, I'll grant you, but obstacles all the same." Josiah's expression didn't change, but something in his pale eyes shifted, like winter light moving across snow, like shadows cast by clouds passing over landscape that had seemed fixed and immutable moments before. Tommy felt the temperature drop another degree, though whether from the weather or the growing tension, he couldn't say. "The boys stolen company property," Crawford continued, gesturing toward the bundle of beaver pelts with the casual authority of a man accustomed to having his statements accepted without question. "Trapped on company land using company resources, violating territorial agreements that have the backing of federal authority. That makes him a thief, and thieves get hung. It's simple frontier justice, the kind that keeps civilization functioning in country where legal niceties can't always be observed." The silence stretched between them like a rope under increasing tension, ready to snap under the accumulated weight of unspoken threats and barely contained violence, of philosophical differences that couldn't be resolved through discussion or compromise. Two different visions of what the territory should become faced each other across 20 yards of unstable ice, each backed by the accumulated force of conviction and bitter experience. Crawford represented the future as he understood it, organized, profitable, controlled by men with the vision and resources to transform wilderness into wealth, to impose order on chaos through the application of superior technology and administrative efficiency. Josiah represented something older and more dangerous, the possibility that men could live outside corporate control, that the wilderness belonged to those willing to accept its terms, rather than those with the power to impose their own. Justice. Josiah spoke the word like he was testing its weight, rolling it around his mouth like a man sampling wine that had gone sour, like someone examining a concept that had been corrupted beyond recognition by those who claimed to serve it. It was perhaps the 10th word he'd spoken in Tommy's presence, and each syllable carried the accumulated force of years of enforced silence, of grief that had been held inside until it transformed into something harder and more dangerous than simple sorrow. Crawford's smile was as cold as the wind coming off the river, as merciless as the winter that killed the unprepared with casual indifference. "That's right, old man. Justice. The kind that keeps civilization functioning, that protects honest business from savages and half-breeds who think they can take what they want without consequences. The kind that makes sure the strong survive and the weak learn their place in the natural order." The ice beneath them sang again, a more urgent note this time, and Tommy felt the surface shift slightly under his feet like something alive and in pain. They were all standing on borrowed time now, balanced on a frozen bridge that could collapse at any moment and plunge them all into water cold enough to kill, cold enough to stop hearts and freeze lungs before help could arrive. "Your kind of justice," Josiah said quietly, his pale eyes never leaving Crawford's face, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of accumulated grief and rage held in careful check. Killed my wife and son for the crime of existing in country you wanted to claim for corporate profit? Killed them for having the wrong color skin in the wrong place at the wrong time when territorial policy required examples to be made? The words fell into the winter air like stones dropped in still water, creating ripples that spread outward in widening circles of understanding and threat, transforming the confrontation from simple pursuit into something infinitely more personal and dangerous. Tommy felt the shift in atmospheric pressure that preceded violent storms, the sense that forces beyond human control were gathering momentum that couldn't be stopped or redirected. Crawford's confident smile flickered for the first time, replaced by the wary expression of a predator who'd suddenly realized his prey might have teeth after all, might represent dangers he hadn't anticipated or prepared for. Tommy felt something fundamental shift in the dynamics of the confrontation, like the moment when a river changes course and begins flowing in an entirely new direction, carving new channels through landscape that had seemed permanent and immutable. The ghost trapper's words had revealed something Crawford couldn't have anticipated. This wasn't just about protecting a half-breed boy from company justice or interfering with legitimate business operations. This was about old debts and older pain, about accounts that had been accumulating interest for 15 years, while a broken man learned to live with silence and grief, while justice deferred had transformed into something harder and more dangerous than simple vengeance. This was about the collision between two different understandings of what justice meant and who had the right to dispense it in territory where federal law existed mainly on paper. Crawford's confident smile flickered like candle flame in wind, replaced by the wary expression of a predator who'd suddenly realized his prey might have teeth after all, might represent variables he hadn't calculated into his assessment of the situation. Ancient history, old man. Whatever happened to your family has nothing to do with current business operations. The past is the past, and dwelling on old grievances doesn't change present realities. Everything to do with it, Josiah replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty, the conviction of a man who'd had 15 years to think about the connections between corporate policy and personal loss, between territorial expansion and individual tragedy. Same company, same methods, same men who think might makes right and call it civilization. Same philosophy that turns murder into policy and calls it progress. The wind picked up, sending snow devils dancing across the ice like spirits made visible, like the ghosts of all those who died when corporate expansion collided with inconvenient humanity. Tommy could feel the surface beneath his feet beginning to flex with increasing frequency, responding to the accumulated weight and stress with warnings that grew more urgent with each passing moment. Dutch Henning's horse snorted nervously, its primitive instincts reading danger in signs its rider couldn't interpret, sensing something in the air that spoke of predators and prey and the terrible mathematics of survival in country where civilization's rules didn't apply. Morrison shifted nervously in his saddle, his rifle wavering slightly as he tried to keep both Josiah and Tommy in his sights simultaneously. The professional killer's confidence shaken by the ghost trapper's revelation and the growing sense that this situation had evolved beyond his experience or training. The mathematical equation of violence had changed, introducing variables that hadn't been part of the original calculation, factors that transformed simple collection work into something infinitely more complex and dangerous. "Look, old man," Crawford said, his tone taking on the reasonable quality of a businessman discussing terms, attempting to regain control of a situation that had slipped beyond his ability to manage through simple intimidation. "Whatever grudge you're carrying, it don't have to involve the boy. Walk away now and we'll settle this between us like civilized men. No need for innocent blood to be spilled over ancient history." Josiah's pale eyes moved to Tommy's face, taking in the fear and desperate hope warring in the boy's dark gaze, reading in those young features the same mixture of courage and defiance that had marked his own son's face in the moments before cavalry justice had claimed him forever. For a moment, Tommy saw something in those weathered features that reminded him of his own grandfather. The same mixture of wisdom and sorrow, the same understanding that some choices defined a man's entire existence. "Been walking away for 15 years, Josiah said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated regret and self-recrimination, the burden of a man who'd chosen survival over confrontation and spent every day since wondering if different choices might have led to different outcomes. Seems like it's time to stop running from debts that compound interest every day they go unpaid." The ice beneath them groaned again. A deeper note this time that spoke of structural failure approaching like avalanche or earthquake, and thin cracks began to appear in the surface, spreading outward from their feet like frost on a window, like the physical manifestation of tensions that had been building beneath the surface for years. Tommy felt his grandfather's presence in the wind that swept across the ice, carrying with it the scent of sage and sweetgrass, the memory of lessons taught beside fires that burned buffalo chips and wisdom older than territorial boundaries. The old man's voice echoed across the years. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, boy. It's the presence of something more important than fear. Honor, duty, the willingness to stand up when standing up is the only choice that matters." Dutch Henning had remained silent throughout the confrontation, but now he spoke up, his voice carrying the nervous edge of a man who understood ice conditions better than his companions, who'd spent enough winters in mountain country to know when environmental dangers posed greater threats than human enemies. "Crawford, we need to get off this surface. It's getting ready to let go. I can hear it singing, and that's never a good sign when you're standing on river ice." The foreman's pale eyes never left Josiah's face, his attention focused entirely on the confrontation that had been building for months. The settling of accounts that transcended immediate concerns about environmental safety. "Not until business is finished, Dutch. We came here to collect stolen property and teach respect for company authority. That's what we're going to do, regardless of how long it takes or what obstacles we encounter." Tommy felt the ghost trapper's hand settle on his shoulder, gentle but firm, communicating reassurance and protection without words, conveying through simple touch the promise that whatever happened next, the boy wouldn't face it alone. The gesture reminded him of his grandfather's hands, weathered by decades of hard living but still capable of infinite gentleness, still able to convey love and protection through simple contact. "Boy's not a thief," Josiah said, his voice carrying across the ice with quiet authority, with the conviction of a man who'd spent enough years reading territorial law to understand its complexities and contradictions. Territory maps show this stretch as unclaimed land, open to any man willing to face its dangers. Been trapping here myself for 5 years, never saw a single company marker or legitimate claim posting. Crawford's laugh was sharp as breaking glass, carrying no humor but plenty of malice, the sound of a man who'd heard similar arguments too many times to find them anything but amusing. "Maps, drawn in Washington, don't mean much out here, old man. What matters is who has the power to enforce their claims, who has the resources to back up territorial assertions with something more substantial than paper and good intentions." The foreman's hand moved to his sidearm with practiced ease, fingers curling around familiar grip with the confidence of a man who'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through the application of superior firepower. "Here's how this is going to work. The boy drops the pelts and comes with us. You disappear back into whatever hole you've been hiding in. Nobody gets hurt who doesn't have to. Simple business transaction, clean and efficient." Tommy felt his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom, like something wild trying to escape the confines of flesh and bone that might not survive the next few minutes. The beaver pelts represented everything: food for the rest of winter, trade goods for spring, the difference between survival and starvation in country that killed the unprepared with casual indifference. But more than that, they represented his grandfather's legacy, the traditional knowledge that company men dismissed as primitive superstition, the understanding of relationships between man and land that transcended simple exploitation. Each pelt had been taken according to ancient protocols, with respect for the animals that provided them and gratitude for the abundance that sustained life in harsh country. Josiah's hand tightened slightly on Tommy's shoulder, a subtle communication that somehow conveyed both protection and permission, the understanding that whatever decision the boy made, the ghost trapper would stand by it regardless of personal cost. The gesture carried the weight of adoption, of claiming kinship that transcended bloodlines and spoke to something deeper than genetics. "And if we refuse?" Tommy found his voice at last. Surprised by how steady it sounded, despite the fear coursing through his veins like ice water, despite the understanding that his next words might determine whether he lived through the morning or joined the bones that littered the canyon floor beneath the ice. Crawford's smile was colder than the wind, more merciless than winter itself, carrying the particular satisfaction of a predator who'd maneuvered his prey into a position where escape was impossible and surrender meant destruction. "Then we solve two problems at once. Company gets its property back, and the territory gets a lesson in what happens to those who think they can operate outside proper authority." The foreman drew his sidearm with practiced ease, the Colt's blue steel reflecting the pale winter light like captured lightning, like crystallized violence waiting to be released. "Been looking forward to this conversation for months, old man. Time to settle some accounts that have been accumulating interest longer than they should have." Morrison and Dutch brought their weapons to bear with professional efficiency, creating a triangle of threat that covered all possible avenues of escape, their movements coordinated by years of experience in situations exactly like this one. The ice gave its final warning with a crack that sounded like the world splitting open, like the fundamental structure of reality failing under accumulated stress that had been building for hours, for days, for years of conflict between forces that couldn't coexist peacefully. The sound was deep and harmonic, vibrating through their bones and speaking of structural failure measured in heartbeats rather than minutes, of catastrophe approaching with the inevitability of avalanche or earthquake. Stress fractures raced across the surface in all directions, creating a web of weakness that could collapse at any moment, transforming solid ground into a trap that would claim anyone unlucky enough to be standing on it when the final failure occurred. The mathematical reality was simple and brutal. They were all balanced on borrowed time, suspended over depths that would kill anyone who fell through the crystalline barrier that separated them from water cold enough to stop hearts in minutes. "We need to move!" Dutch shouted, his horse dancing nervously as it felt the surface shifting beneath its hooves, its primitive instincts reading danger in signs that its rider was only beginning to understand. "This whole section's about to go. I've seen ice failure before, and this has all the signs." But Crawford kept his gun trained on Josiah and Tommy, his pale eyes bright with the particular madness that came when a man's need for control overcame his instinct for survival, when ideology became more important than the basic mathematics of staying alive in country that killed the unprepared with casual efficiency. "Nobody moves until I say so. This ends here one way or another. Company business doesn't get postponed for weather conditions." Tommy felt the ghost trapper's muscles coil like a spring under tension, felt the subtle shift in stance that spoke of violence about to be unleashed with devastating efficiency. But instead of attacking, instead of drawing whatever weapons he carried concealed beneath his winter clothing, Josiah did something that caught everyone completely off guard. Something that transformed the nature of the confrontation in ways that none of them could have anticipated. He began to sing. The voice that emerged from Josiah's throat was nothing like the careful, measured tones he'd used for speech, nothing like the sparse communication that had marked his interaction with Tommy. It was deeper, richer, carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the bones of the mountains and the heart of the winter wind, from sources older than human civilization and more enduring than territorial boundaries drawn on maps. It was a Lakota death song, Tommy realized with shock, that ran through him like electricity. The ancient melody warriors sang when they prepared to join their ancestors, when earthly concerns fell away and only honor remained, when the focus narrowed to the essential truth that some things were worth dying for regardless of the odds against survival. But there was something else woven into the traditional phrases, something that spoke of love rather than war, of protection rather than vengeance, of a man who'd found in this moment the purpose that had eluded him for 15 years of wandering in wilderness, both literal and spiritual. The melody carried grief transformed into strength, sorrow alchemized into something harder and more precious than simple gold. The effect on Crawford and his men was immediate and profound, striking them with the force of revelation that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. Horses that had been steady under gunfire began to snort and dance, their primitive instincts recognizing something their riders couldn't understand, something that spoke to awareness older than human domestication of the natural world. Morrison's rifle wavered as he tried to make sense of what he was witnessing, his professional killer's confidence shaken by the confrontation with something beyond his experience or training. The death song carried power that had nothing to do with weapons or physical force, authority that transcended corporate backing or territorial law. Even the ice seemed to respond to the ancient melody, its groaning taking on a different quality, as if the very molecules of frozen water were aligning themselves with something older than human conflict, something that recognized the power of sacrifice offered freely rather than extracted through force. Tommy felt tears freezing on his cheeks as he recognized fragments of the song, melody lines his Crow grandmother had hummed while working hides, ancient phrases that connected all the mountain tribes in a web of shared memory and common purpose that transcended the artificial boundaries white men drew on maps to divide territory into profitable parcels. The ghost trapper wasn't just singing a death song. He was weaving together threads of tradition that Crawford's kind had spent decades trying to cut, demonstrating the existence of connections that couldn't be severed by policy or destroyed by force, that persisted in the hearts and memories of those who carried the old knowledge forward into an uncertain future. "What the hell?" Morrison began, but his words were lost in the rising intensity of Josiah's voice, in harmonics that seemed to call forth responses from the ice itself, from the wind moving through the pines, from forces that had shaped this country long before company maps divided it into profitable parcels or territorial governments, claimed jurisdiction over land that belonged to no human authority. Crawford's gun hand began to shake, not from cold, but from something deeper. The recognition that he was witnessing something beyond his understanding or control, something that reduced his authority to meaningless noise against the vast indifference of the natural world and the enduring power of human connections that transcended corporate structure or governmental backing. The ice continued to sing its own song of impending collapse, stress fractures spreading like disease through the crystalline structure. But somehow, Josiah's voice wove itself into that dangerous melody, creating harmony where there had been only discord, finding balance in the midst of chaos that threatened to claim them all. Dutch Henning felt his horse respond to the ancient song with movements that had nothing to do with training or discipline, primitive responses that connected the animal to awareness older than human civilization, older than the territorial conflicts that defined frontier commerce and determined who lived where under what conditions. As the last notes of the death song faded into winter silence, Josiah's pale eyes opened and fixed on Crawford's face with the intensity of a man who had made peace with whatever consequences awaited him, who had found in this moment the purpose that had eluded him for 15 years of wandering in wilderness, both literal and spiritual. The foreman's gun was still trained on the ghost trapper's chest, but something fundamental had changed in the mathematics of the confrontation, some alteration in the balance of power that couldn't be measured with instruments or calculated with formulas, but could be felt by every man present like atmospheric pressure before a storm. "You want to shoot?" Josiah asked quietly, his voice carrying none of the fear Crawford had expected to hear, none of the desperation that company men had learned to exploit in those who challenged their authority. "Go ahead. But that boy walks away clean, no matter what happens to me. That's not negotiation, that's simple fact, carved in stone and backed by forces older than your company's corporate charter." Tommy felt the world balanced on a knife's edge. Every heartbeat an eternity that might be his last, every breath a gift that might not be repeated. The ice beneath their feet had grown increasingly unstable, stress fractures spreading like a disease through the crystalline structure, responding to accumulated weight and tension with warnings that grew more urgent with each passing second. Crawford's finger tightened on the trigger, his pale eyes bright with frustrated rage and wounded authority, with the particular madness that came when ideology collided with reality and found reality insufficiently cooperative. The foreman represented everything that was wrong with territorial expansion, the transformation of wilderness into commodity and human beings into obstacles to be removed or assets to be exploited. But before he could complete the motion that would change everything, before he could pull the trigger that would end Josiah's life and seal Tommy's fate, the ice made its own decision about the morning's outcome. The surface collapsed with a sound like thunder, like the fundamental structure of the world failing under accumulated stress, dropping Crawford and his horse into water cold enough to stop a heart, and in that moment of chaos and desperate survival, Tommy learned that sometimes salvation came not through violence or surrender, but through the simple willingness to stand between the weak and those who would prey upon them, even when the cost might be everything you had left to give. The frozen river had claimed its tribute, but the real reckoning was just beginning. In the distance, Tommy could see Crawford's men struggling in water that would kill them in minutes, and he understood that the ghost trapper's song had summoned more than just ancestral spirits. It had called forth justice older than territorial law and more enduring than corporate power.